Welcome to Future Trends, where we examine the latest stories reshaping tomorrow's international dynamics. This week's headlines: Israel's Yellow Line moves further into Gaza, UN to close Human Rights Office in Burkina Faso, Australia and Fiji in surprise new military pact, Russia using jet-powered drones in mass attacks against Ukraine, EU targets Chinese imports, and only a fraction of living insect species discovered. Starting with politics, Algeria's ruling FLN secures most seats in parliament in low turnout. With just 21% of the 25 million electorate casting ballots, the National Liberation Front secured 90 out of 407 seats in the poll, which was marred by public apathy and controversy over the government's disqualification of roughly a third of would-be candidates. UN to close its Human Rights Office in Burkina Faso following junta's suspension. Junta Chief Captain Traoré has pursued anti-Western policies since seizing power in a coup in September 2022. While critical voices are met with repression, the United Nations said the authorities' indefinite suspension of its operations meant it could not carry out its duties. Canada and Philippines seek stronger ties as Ottawa looks beyond US trade. Canadian Prime Minister Carney and Philippine President Marcos Jr. pledged to strengthen trade, energy and security ties as Canada works to diversify its economy beyond the US and deepen its engagement in the Indo-Pacific. The two leaders pledged to pursue a Canada-Philippines free trade agreement, deepen defense and maritime cooperation, and strengthen economic ties supported by Canada's 1 million-strong Filipino community. Commission moves to retake control of EU enlargement process. The European Commission is drafting new reform proposals aimed at reclaiming ownership of the enlargement debate, after member states advance their own position papers proposing changes to the accession process. The move signals Brussels' intent to set the agenda on EU expansion rather than cede direction to individual capitals. France builds relations with Oman. France is looking to build its influence in the region by strengthening relations with Oman, a small country long seen as a quiet, neutral regional player. On his first state visit to France, Sultan Haitham bin Tariq and French President Macron announced a series of major contracts for French companies. Moving to stories in conflict, Israel's Yellow Line moves further into Gaza. Israel now controls 60% of Gaza, its military has confirmed, up from the 53% agreed to in last year's ceasefire negotiations. Concrete blocks used to mark the so-called Yellow Line, which marks the boundary of Israeli-controlled territory, is often moved without notice, according to residents. However, Israel says it warns civilians of its movements. Russia using jet-powered drones in mass attacks against Ukraine. It is counting on the limited supply of missiles used by Ukraine's air defenses to intercept them. Meanwhile, Russia has closed railway border crossings with Finland, Estonia and Latvia, with the largest number of closures on the Finnish border. Syria rules out Lebanon intervention, despite US pressure to act against Hezbollah. Syria said it seeks to avoid escalation and focus on rebuilding ties with Beirut. US President Trump has repeatedly said that Syria could take care of Hezbollah, criticizing Israel's strategy in its war with the Iran-backed militant group. Australia and Fiji in surprise new military pact. It elevated their military alliance to the highest levels, including a mutual defense obligation that would require either country to respond should the other come under military attack. Australia already has defense treaties with the US, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. China test-fired ballistic missile armed with a dummy warhead in the Pacific Ocean. The test was confirmed by state media outlet Xinhua, which reported the test of a strategic missile launched from a submarine. Now for the latest economics news. EU targets Chinese imports amid trade talks. The bloc has scrapped its customs exemption on parcels valued under $171 and introduced a $3.43 levy on low-value imports, targeting the roughly 16 million packages of which 91% are from China, that arrive daily from platforms such as Temu and Shein. The move comes as the EU runs a trade deficit with China of nearly $411 billion, importing $639 billion in goods against $228 billion in exports in 2025. Pressure mounts on Ireland to stop alumina sales to Russia. Dublin is under mounting pressure to end its alumina sales to Russia as it takes over the rotating presidency of the EU Council. Ireland says it will not commit to sanctions until an internal investigation is concluded. Eurozone unemployment rate table at record low 6.2% in May. The figure underscored the continued tightness of the European job market, even as broader economic uncertainties linger across the continent, and maintains inflation as a priority issue following the ECB's latest interest rate rise in June. Cooling US jobs data buys the Fed and stock market more time. A tepid June jobs report offers relief for US equities, just as investors had begun to worry that excessive labor market strength might force the Federal Reserve to turn more hawkish in its fight against inflation, hobbling high-flying tech stocks that have driven this year's rally. US job growth slowed more than expected in June, and payroll gains for the prior 2 months were revised lower, pointing to a cooling but still stable labor market. UAE crude output nears record following OPEC exit. The United Arab Emirates reportedly raised its crude output to near record highs above 3.8 million barrels per day in June after it quit OPEC to escape production caps. June's output was the highest since April 2020, exceeding levels seen before the Iran war and providing an early vindication of the UAE's decision to leave OPEC and OPEC Plus on May 1st to free production from quota restrictions. Turning to development. Almost 1.2 million apply for Spain's migrant regularisation scheme. The government of Socialist Prime Minister Sanchez, a standard-bearer of more open immigration policies, launched the plan while European neighbours toughen measures in response to pressure from ascendant far-right parties. Latin America accounted for 67% of the submissions, with Colombia alone representing 25.9% of the total, followed by African nationalities with 22.9%. Cambodia and Thailand conciliation to unlock oil and gas reserves in disputed territory. Resolution of a decades-long maritime territorial dispute in the Gulf of Thailand could lead to unlocking hundreds of billions of dollars in oil and gas reserves. Phnom Penh has filed a notice for compulsory consultation under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which Cambodia and Thailand are both party to. 120 dead in Sudan's latest cholera outbreak. At least 120 people have died and over 1,100 suspected cases have been reported since May, with the outbreak centered on West Kordofan state, the frontline dividing Sudan's warring army and RSF forces. It is the country's third cholera wave in as many years, arriving just 2 months after the previous outbreak was declared over, as more than 3 years of war have gutted the healthcare system and left the WHO warning of near-continuous outbreaks. German tax cuts, pension overhaul among measures to invigorate economy. Among the 34 measures presented by Chancellor Merz and his government coalition partners also were tougher rules for employees' sick leave and a reduction of the country's bureaucracy. Merz's coalition of centre-right and centre-left parties took office just over a year ago with pledges to reform and turn around Germany's sluggish economy, Europe's biggest. Cuba suffers nationwide blackout as US pressure continues. The total collapse of the national electrical grid comes as Cuba faces an ongoing energy crisis, worsened by an effective US blockade on fuel shipments. Finally, our social news. Scientists have only discovered a tiny fraction of living insect species. About 1 million insect species have been described, but a team of entomologists estimates there may be as many as 20 million insect species on our planet, more than 3 times the previous estimate. Scientists have long debated exactly how many insect species there are, with the previous consensus being about 6 million. Why Antarctica froze millions of years before the Arctic? New research points to a geological uplift of an eastern Antarctic mountain range that crossed an elevation threshold, allowing glaciers to form and expand, triggering the vast East Antarctic ice sheet some 34 million years ago. This occurred when global temperatures were around 5 degrees Celsius warmer than today, explaining why the South Pole accumulated permanent ice cover 25 million years before long-term global cooling eventually allowed the Arctic to follow. Hunger in northern Nigeria, reaching crisis levels. Conflict, together with shrinking humanitarian assistance, is driving a food crisis to levels not seen in nearly a decade. More than 17 million people across 9 conflict-affected states are experiencing crisis, emergency, or catastrophic levels of hunger. Nigeria has been battling a jihadist insurgency since 2009, with a resurgence in violence since 2025. China restores over 10 million hectares of desertified land. The country's desertified land area has continued to shrink, from an average annual expansion of 343,300 hectares in the late 1990s to a net reduction of 666,600 hectares per year today. Since 2023, the central government has invested $13 billion in 544 key projects covering 16.3 million hectares of land. 5,000-year-old wolves found on remote island rewrite domestication thinking. Ancient wolves found on a remote island may reveal that prehistoric humans were keeping and caring for wolves thousands of years before dogs fully emerged. Scientists discovered ancient wolves on a tiny Baltic island, where they could only have been brought by humans, suggesting an unexpectedly close relationship between people and wolves thousands of years ago. Evidence indicates the wolves were fed, possibly cared for, and may even have been managed or selectively bred long before modern ideas of domestication. That's your Future Trends update for this week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with more stories reshaping our world.